Why does Progressive work hard for truckers? Because truckers unite the world. They unite kids with their first drum sets and parents with earplugs. But truckers can't do this if they're not on the road. That's why Progressive has over 360 heavy truck employees to help truckers stay on time and on track. Quote truck insurance today in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates.
Podcasting isn't just about talking. It's about growing, engaging, and monetizing. And that's where Podcast One Pro comes in. Whether you're an independent creator or a major brand, Podcast One Pro gives you the tools you need to take your podcast to the next level. We're talking about premium hosting, advanced analytics, dynamic ad integration, and expert distribution, all designed to maximize your reach and revenue. Plus, with access to Podcast One's industry-leading network, you'll be connected to top-tier advertisers and a massive audience. It's time to go pro and turn your passion into profit. Visit podcastonepro.com to get started today. Podcast One Pro, the power behind the podcast.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my award-winning co-host, Brett.
Oh, well, that was nice.
Just
that
kidding.
So unusual. Oh.
You're not the award-winning co-host. I had to put it in there because really what works... you see how I cut you off there, Brett? I'm sorry. We're going to get a one-star review, how I'm woman-splaining to you. But I'm just so excited because I have to jump in. This entire episode needs to just be you guys hearing from our guest today because we really do have an award-winning author and podcaster and advocate here, Andrea Dunlop, who is the author of 5 books. If you haven't read them, we'll list them all. You need to get them all. But you may have heard her voice over and over because she is now on season 7 of Nobody Should Believe Me. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Alice. Wow, what an intro. Sorry you got thrown under the bus there, Brett.
You know, it happens a lot. And frankly, she's right. We're so honored to have you. So glad that you would take some time to join us. We've talked about you before on our show. We covered briefly the Take Care of Maya case and told everybody to go listen to your awesome work on that. And if you haven't done that, you should. And you should listen to all the other seasons as well. And we're just really glad to have you. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us.
Oh, absolutely. And yes, I appreciate the shout out of my coverage of the Kowalski case. I know some listeners did find the show because of that, because I heard from some folks. So yeah, I appreciate that. And that's been a lonely endeavor here in the media the last couple of years covering that case. So.
Well, it may have been lonely for the couple of years, but it really has, I think, picked up speed here. And before we jump too far into that, because you've been an incredible advocate for entire medical kidnapping, really, I think you came up with kind of that term. I think. Oh
no, that's what they call it. That is terminology from the conspiracy theorists themselves. I think I've been one of the.
Gotcha.
I've been one of the first people to sort of talk about it.
You've delved into it, but before you delved into it, I'd love for you to give kind of a little background of who you are, because you started. This was not, you didn't wake up one day and think, I'm just going to do all this investigative podcasting journalism into this. You actually have a very different background and would love to hear about your background and how you ended up covering these cases.
Yeah. So truly, to your point, a pretty unexpected career pivot actually for me. I did not envision that my career would become reporting on child abuse cases. I sort of marvel at that sometimes because I am actually sort of super sensitive person. I can't watch horror movies. And I'm just like, this is a weird choice for your life, Andrea. But here we are. Sometimes you
and Alice have a lot in common, apparently.
But I think also, sometimes if you have a strong sense of justice, you end up doing things that you might not have expected you would do. And that was certainly the case for me. So yeah, my backstory and how I came to be a podcaster, I had this situation in my own family with my sister that happened. Well, I would say it came to a head 15 years ago when we became estranged during the first investigation into her for medical child abuse, also more commonly known as Munchausen by proxy, which is a form of abuse in which a caregiver fabricates, exaggerates, or induces illness. Usually a mother, usually a small child is the victim for the purposes of attention, sympathy, control over other people. It's a widely misunderstood phenomenon. And I came to realize that very quickly as we were going through that situation as a family. Again, this is, 15 years ago. That situation happened in my own life. I was not ready to talk about it for a long time. When I had my first child in 2018, it sort of, as happens when you become a parent, I think it brings up any, especially anything you have around your immediate family sort of comes roaring back. And that happened for me. And so at that point, I was a novelist. I still am a novelist, but that was my, really main aspiration at that point was to make my living doing that, which is a difficult thing to do. But I did have a couple of books out from my publisher at that point. And so my third novel, We Came Here to Forget, ended up incorporating a lot of my family experience. And I sort of thought, okay, this is going to be my moment to metabolize this terrible thing that's happened to me. Obviously fiction writers are often drawing, if not always drawing on their own experience in some way. And I sort of thought, great. And then I'll do some media so that I can tell people, hey, this is based on a real experience so that people could have a touch point within the media of this is actually from someone with a lived experience around this abuse. And at that time, when I was working on that, that was when the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case was blowing up. For those who do not know, which is probably not very many of your listeners, but the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case, this was a young woman who ended up conspiring with an online boyfriend to murder her abusive mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. And it was a huge, very sensationalized crime story. But it was, the first time a lot of people had heard of Munchausen by proxy. And so there was sort of this spike in interest about this form of abuse, but a lot of people were still misunderstanding it, kind of getting it wrong. And so I thought, I can be a helpful voice in this. And then, sure enough, I connected with an interview with a journalist about it. I connected with a wonderful man called Dr. Mark Feldman, who's just one of the top experts. He's a psychiatrist. As a professor, he's written several books on Munchausen by proxy, just truly a preeminent expert. And I connected with him, and that sort of led me down this path of connecting with some of the academics and experts that have been really dedicated to trying to help, solve this problem of how we deal with this abuse, raise awareness of this abuse. And that ended up being the impetus for the podcast because it turned out I had a lot more to say about it. And here I am years later, still talking about it. And, the show originally launched as an 8-episode limited series. And then we made a second season and it took off during our second season. And now we make a couple of seasons a year and do a weekly episode in between. As you guys know, crime is, I think, such a fascinating area because it does connect us to so many things that are just deeply human and why people do these terrible things, the systems that they're a part of. I mean, it's all so interesting. And so it has been, although the material is very difficult and that does, wear on me and the team sometimes, it is never boring. There is always just so much more to sort of, there's less rabbit holes upon rabbit holes upon rabbit holes open. So at first I thought, starting a podcast about Munchausen by proxy cases, which we have expanded a little bit in this new season, and I can talk about that. But, I was like, this is a pretty niche topic. And then I was just like, well, yes and no, because it also has to do with the criminal justice system, the child protection system, the healthcare system, medical misinformation. I mean, just the media, just go on and on and on in just sort of these concentric circles. So that's my Cliff Notes. How's that?
Can I say, I appreciate you calling it medical child abuse and Munchausen by proxy because
factitious disorder imposed on another. Yeah, it doesn't quite roll off the tongue. Name. Yeah. We have a bit of a branding / nomenclature issue in the field and there's 15 other names for it that sometimes people try and introduce. And we're just like, guys, let's just
medical child abuse. Actually, that's perfect because that's essentially what it is, right?
Yeah, it is. And I think the reason I use both terms, medical child abuse is the crime, right? So that's using the medical system to abuse your child. And if you are being, it is not a crime, right? This is as you guys are prosecutors, you'll have an appreciation for this, because there are no laws on the books about medical child abuse specifically. It gets fitted into these other things like injury to a child or child endangerment or assault. And so it can be very tricky to sort of fit the whole picture of this pattern of abuse into a criminal charge, which is sort of one of many issues with it. But Munchausen by proxy abuse, I still use that terminology because, well, the medical stuff is the piece of the abuse that's going to land someone on a prosecutor's desk, for example. The abuse is really all encompassing. It's also emotional abuse, educational abuse. The kids are often pulled out of school for long periods of time, psychological abuse. And so I do kind of like having those two terms.
No, I think that's incredibly powerful. You hit on something that actually exists in many different areas of the criminal justice system, which is that this particular very serious abuse doesn't fit squarely within the laws that are written. And it's hard to write something like that because there's familial relationships, there's psychology, there's psychiatry, there's so many things that go around it. And it's difficult to put your finger on it. I mean, with that, as you've delved into all these other cases, drawing from your own experience, I mean, there's no real answer there. What are some of the difficulties you've seen where the criminal justice system falls short, specifically in these Munchausen by proxy cases?
Yeah, I'm smiling over here because I'm just like, well, how long do we have for this interview? I mean, unfortunately, what I've discovered, and, it is interesting to sort of come from this place of having a lived experience in complete isolation. The first time that I met someone else who had been through a Munchausen by proxy case was Sheriff Wayburn, who I met at this conference that I went to, where I met Detective Mike Weber, who is my co-author on my last book and is a frequent collaborator on the show. And the second person I met who'd been, a family member of a perpetrator was Hope Ybarra's younger sister, Robin, which was the very first interview I did for the podcast. So, when I was going through it in isolation, what I observed was, because the first case, there wasn't even a criminal investigation into my sister. It was just a CPS investigation. The state did not end up bringing dependency charges. So, for those that don't know, like when the state is filing to take custody away from parents, they did not end up filing dependency charges. They kind of put a safety plan in place and just left things as they were. And so my observations of my first, that first case that we went through, my sister was investigated in a second time, and there was a police investigation. No charges were filed against her. That's a whole sort of complicated morass. But, CPS has failed my family in this instance, right? Like, this is our sort of one of one. And then as I expanded my lens and spoke to all of these other people, I was like, oh, that's the norm. It's very rare for, and CPS also doesn't have a designation for medical child abuse, except for in a couple of states. I want to say it's, Arizona is one of them, and now I'm blanking on the other one, but there's only that designation for CPS or DCF in a couple of states. And otherwise, they're trying to shoehorn it again into medical neglect, which, if you are used to looking at medical neglect cases, which are obviously more common, right? Then you're like, whoa, well, this isn't medical neglect. This
That's the opposite.
taking their child to the doctor all the time, and they're over here, they're fundraising for their kids' treatments. Like, this person is a great mom, And so I think it's one of those things where it's like, if you don't know what you're looking at, then you're sunk, right? Like, it's very hard to get people up to speed in real time during a case. And that is often what happens. You often have CPS investigators that are not super familiar with this abuse. You have detectives that are not familiar with this abuse. Nobody gets any training on this. And so, except when they sort of make a point to, like, my colleagues do trainings. Mike Weber does a lot of trainings for law enforcement and stuff. But unless law enforcement is actively trying to go get training on it, there's no required training for anywhere in the country. So it is really challenging because it's one of those things where, in my experience, if you know what you're looking at, and I think that's what's been fascinating about getting into all of these other cases, is they all have their own strange, sort of personal pieces, and they all have their own weird flavor, but the pattern of abuse is very similar in most of these cases. And, the types of diseases they focus on, the conversation around it, the way they talk about their children. It's just like, it really is, you see these things, the super premature birth, the feeding tubes that aren't necessary, seizures that no one else sees. You just see these things over and over again in these cases. And you realize that, oh, this is such a pattern. It's such a, I don't want to use profiling, but you really do see, like, oh, there's a pattern. This is a pattern of abuse. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But if it's your first time, it's so confusing. It's so overwhelming. If you're still trying to wrap your head around the fact that someone even would do this or why they would do it, then, it's just like the investigation's going to get bungled every time. And unfortunately, that is what happens most of the time.
So the only thing I know about Munchausen by proxy, I learned from Gypsy Rose Blanchard and your podcast. So anything I get wrong, I'm just going to blame on you. I'm just going to put that out there. But
maybe it's just because you weren't listening hard enough. No.
So one thing that seems to be a difficulty in this is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm willing to be wrong, the victims often don't realize they're victims because they are also indoctrinated into believing that they have this. That seems like a huge difficulty for law enforcement and prosecutors and state government. Like we often talk about, the government, prosecution, police, everything, law, is designed for the ordinary case, the average case. And whenever you have an extraordinary case, those are the ones that fall through the cracks. And that seems like a huge problem with this.
It is, yeah. And you're completely right that most people, and I mean, unfortunately, we don't have good long-term data on survivors. I have one colleague, Dr. Kathy Ayub, who's working on a long-term study. She's with Harvard. But, this is not a population. Munchausen by proxy survivors are not a population that has been studied. And so, but it's certainly in my experience with this population and with, Munchausen Support, which is the nonprofit that I founded several years ago, in talking to survivors and sort of looking at many of these cases, oftentimes they understand something's wrong, right? They understand that something is off, something's not right, something doesn't fit, but they don't have, especially because awareness, just general awareness of this has been so low, they don't have a name for it. And so oftentimes, you'll see that people only realize what they've been through when they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. I have this extraordinary story of someone who reached out to make a donation to Munchausen Support because his mother had, on her deathbed, told her family that she was a victim of this and gave them a directive to go find an organization that supports survivors and victims. And lo and behold, we were the only one. I mean, it's very common that people don't even realize what's happened to them. And then they have to go on this whole odyssey, right, of getting their medical records and trying to sort of put all the pieces back together and figure out what was real and what wasn't real. Because of course, there are, number one, there are health consequences to having to undergo unnecessary medications, unnecessary surgeries. I mean, those things can cause a lot of health issues that then are very real that they need treatment for. And of course, a Munchausen by proxy victim can also have a condition, right? That's one of the biggest sort of misconceptions is that people will say, take the Maya Kowalski case, so much of that conversation got fixated on, does this child have CRPS? Did she have CRPS or not? Now, I, unfortunately, having spent so many hours on that case, don't believe that she does because of the way that diagnosis came about, because her mother was searching for it, reported it to doctors before it had ever been diagnosed, got diagnosed by this man, Anthony Kirkpatrick, who is just a whole other ball of wax. I mean, it's truly such a wild character, and I'm down a big rabbit hole about him right now and so I won't completely, redirect the interview to talking about him. But, I don't believe that diagnosis was legitimate. There is no reason to believe that. You heard people who were genuine experts talking about how nothing about this fit. She had this whole body CRPS, whatever. But even if she did have CRPS, the standard of care for CRPS is not massive infusions of ketamine and medically induced comas in Mexico. So that is still abuse regardless. And so I think people can get hyper focused on, well, this child really is sick. Okay, well, that does not preclude medical abuse. It's still a matter of unnecessary treatments, exaggeration. Is that parent making it worse? Are they doing the things that doctors tell them to do, such as get psychiatric help, get PT, get OT? And often you find out that, not only are they pursuing these extreme treatments, they're also foregoing the treatments that they're being told to follow for what may actually be going on with their child. So it's very confusing. Children, especially if they're left in the home, which they most often are, when they get to be a bit older, when they get to be teenagers, they are being co-opted as part of the charade, right? So, we'll hear from survivors that they're being told behind the scenes, you have to tell the doctor that you're sick. You have to tell them because you are sick. And if you don't say X, Y, and Z, then they won't believe you and then you won't get the help you need and you'll die. And so they're being threatened and coerced in a variety of ways behind the scenes. And you can just imagine that having, your primary caregiver lie to you about your health from the time that you're born would really disrupt your mind-body connection and your just ability to even understand what's going on with your own health. So it's very, very complex.
Insurance isn't one size fits all, and shopping for it shouldn't feel like squeezing into something that just doesn't fit. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they show you options that fit your budget. Enough hunting for discounts, trying to calculate rates, and tinkering with coverages.
Maybe you're picking out your very first policy, or maybe you're just looking for something that works better for you and your family. Either way, they make it simple to see your options. No guesswork, no surprises. Ready to see how easy and fun shopping for insurance can be? Visit Progressive.com and give the Name Your Price tool a try. Take the stress out of shopping and find coverage that fits your life on your terms. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
You started out by saying that this is an intersection of the healthcare system, of the justice system, of familial connections. And you're touching on this right here. This is so interesting because a lot of people will say, how? How is it possible that an otherwise perfectly child can be? You do have to get through a medical system, right? This is not medical neglect. You do actually have to, at some point, for this kind of ball to start rolling, to get a doctor to say, well, maybe something is wrong, so let's try this. And then it's exaggerated and it goes off the rails. But I can imagine, especially leading into criminal investigation, to say how. Well, what you're saying here is so interesting because we know that a lot of these diagnoses are dependent, obviously, on reporting by the patient. And then if the patient can't speak or is too young to know what to happen, their guardian, which is usually a parent of some sort. I mean, is that a flaw within the medical system? It can't be a flaw because we know that, like, for example, the pain system, the doctor doesn't know how much it hurts when I have this cut or what type of medicine they need to give me. So there has to be some communication with the patient. But what could you possibly do to prevent this sort of massive disconnect between diagnosis and maybe what's being told in the medical system? And then I'll go one step further and you can speak on this. I will throw lawyers under the bus and say the reason they can't disregard that is because of fear of litigation, right? If a doctor just completely ignores what they're being told and say, I don't see this, and they miss it, they mess it up, there's real fear of liability. So I threw a morass at you, but the point being, it is kind of this convoluted spaghetti junction.
Yeah, no, for sure it is. And I think, it's multi-pronged, and I think any solutions that are going to be effective have to be similarly sort of multi-pronged. Part of the issue is with our healthcare system, right, which is, has all kinds of complications and is difficult to deal with for any regular person on a regular day. And parents really exploit the weaknesses of our healthcare system in a very sort of premeditated and patterned way. And so, part of doctor culpability is complicated because there are some cases, and you sort of have to look at it within, but then also looking at what we can do as a system to make it better. But when you look at these cases, like for instance, a typical presentation is a baby is born premature. I have a strong belief that many of those cases are induced labor because we've had perpetrators come forward, and speak to Dr. Mark Feldman and talk about how they did it. It's really not that hard to induce labor if that is your intention. And, because this pattern of behavior often starts way before a perpetrator ever becomes pregnant, it makes sense to me that this would be a piece of it. And there are frequently obstetrical complications. Early birth, you have, if you have several children, like you did in Hope Ibarra's case or my sister's case, they're born increasingly premature. So you have this, presentation where there's a premature birth. Any baby that's born at 24, 25, 26 weeks is going to have genuine medical complications. And so it sort of starts there, right? And so the doctors are responding to something that is real, right? And then from there, the mother will say that the child is spitting up everything they eat, or they're feeding them all the time, but they're still not gaining weight. And so they get diagnosed failure to thrive. That, as a pediatrician, is very hard to know if someone's lying about, because you can't monitor whether or not that person, and most parents, right, would never lie about that. And so pediatrics is, designed around most parents. It's sort of designed around the idea that caregivers are going to be honest with their child's doctors about what is happening with their child. And so when you have someone who isn't being honest, it really exploits that trust and makes it impossible in many cases for them to do their job. So, you have this sort of series of events where then they have a feeding tube, and then, the NG tube's not, the one that goes in through the nose isn't working. Now they need a surgical tube. Now they need to be put on intravenous nutrition. Now they need, this surgery called a Nissen fundoplication that comes up all the time in these cases where it's to correct reflux, but the reflux isn't actually happening. And so, it can escalate really fast, even sort of from the get-go. I think where you see more doctor culpability, in my opinion, is that, you have doctors that just are letting the parent act like the medical authority. And I've seen this a ton with perpetrators have really infiltrated, this is so sad, because people with rare diseases have it hard enough. They do, experience genuine barriers to getting the care they need. They are sometimes gaslit by doctors, right? When you look at these pain disorders and stuff that these perpetrators have so successfully infiltrated. But, they will go down these rabbit holes. Well, then the parent will say, well, I'm the expert on my child and you have to listen to me. And, doctors will just say, well, that test came back negative twice, but if you want me to run it again, okay. If we want me to give your child another MRI, okay, we'll do it. And they'll sort of just really do capitulate to parents' wants a lot. And I think that line has gotten increasingly blurry because of, and I think one of the things I've been tracking on the show that is, fascinating and horrifying is that, there has been a massive loss of faith in institutions sort of writ large in our country. And the medical system is part of that, right? And that's because of a lot of reasons. That's because of a lot of misinformation about vaccines, about COVID. That's because of, I think, in part, bad communication on the part of some of these medical bodies. I think they could do a better job communicating with the public in some ways, not to blame them for everything, because I think the media has played a huge role in stoking all of that medical misinformation. But, you now have situations where just regular pediatricians, let alone people who deal with child abuse, are spending, so much of their time arguing with parents about whether or not to vaccinate their children or give them a vitamin K shot after they're born. And just having these parents come in and ask these questions, well, which lot number did this vaccine come from? And, I read this and I read that. And this is coming in with this sort of expertise, that they've acquired. And that's just, a lot of those people are not abusers. They're just anxious parents. They're parents who've gotten bad information, parents who've had social media feed a bunch of bad information to them. And so when you look at it in that context, right, and then you look at someone who is purposefully abusing and exploiting that system, it puts doctors in a tough spot. And then on top of that, now you have this situation where, and I think this has always been true, but it's absolutely accelerated, especially since the Kowalski case, right? And now that's been overturned with appeal, but there are all these other lawsuits that are very similar, where they're coming after doctors for, diagnosing abusive injuries or making the diagnosis of medical child abuse or, whatever else. So it's these perpetrators get very fixated on doctors that won't give them what they want. And they get very fixated on doctors, especially that raise the alarm about them, and will just go above and beyond to try and ruin that person's life. And they really abuse the legal system to do that, and with these frivolous lawsuits and taking these doctors to court. And so it's really, I have a lot of sympathy for doctors. And then at the same time, I've seen cases like our season 6 case where we had this extraordinary phone call that was recorded with Dr. Jane Ness, who was the treating physician for this child who died. It was the child of a known perpetrator who'd been convicted for abusing her other child. And then he died of a non-fatal disease when he was 9 years old that he almost certainly didn't have. And we had this phone call with the doctor that was recorded where, she said this is his main treating physician who is around a lot. And probably, we never able to confirm this, but was likely the person who'd signed off on him going into home hospice care where he passed away. And she said, oh, I had a lot of concerns about this case and I knew she'd been convicted before. And he kept coming in with these mysterious versus instances of sepsis, which were likely a result of poisoning, which she'd done to her other child, and this, and his diagnosis didn't fit. And I never saw a positive test for this alleged condition that he had. And my jaw was on the floor. I just thought, and she's wondering out loud, did I help kill a child? And you're just like, what? So while I have a lot of sympathy for doctors and they need better support all the way down, right? I mean, I don't know what everyone thinks is going to be the end game here of burning out our entire medical, like every doctor in the country. Like, I'm sorry, but you will all need a doctor. We will all need doctors. I don't think we want to get them out of existence. It's like, I have a lot of sympathy for what they're dealing with. And again, case by case, I've also seen doctors just take incredible risks to protect children, to save children who are in these situations. And I think those doctors deserve our admiration, but it is very hard. And also, something I've heard from many doctors talking to them in this space is pediatricians are nice, non-confrontational people. You're not talking about these sort of hard driving, ego driven brain surgeon types, right? They're different types of doctors are different types. And pediatricians are sweethearts, right? I mean, there's a type of person that becomes a pediatrician and they want to work with parents and they don't want to have these big, sort of confrontational moments. Now, child abuse pediatricians are sort of that person, but with this sort of other extraordinary set of sort of characteristics. But your average pediatrician, they want to maintain a good relationship with that parent. Their work depends on it. So I think they don't often, sort of put their foot down and be like, hey, I am actually the person who went to medical school. So your opinion is not as valid as my opinion. And I think we've just gone completely off of that. And now there's all of this sort of patient. And I don't want to say all of this is bad either, right? Because when diseases are under-recognized, when people are getting, two of us on this call are female. They didn't do anything about women. It's sort of we were a completely, still are kind of an underserved. It's people are hey, half the population goes through childbirth and, menopause and stuff. We're not going to study those things. But obviously that advocacy, it really has a place and it is really important, but it's just the ways in which it's getting co-opted by perpetrators is really alarming.
Let me ask you this. I want to transition to season 7 because I want you to be able to talk about that, but this is all just so fascinating. So when you talk about perpetrators, it's hard for me not to see it through the prosecutor lens and things like intent. Obviously, if you have someone who is literally poisoning their child to generate health issues so that they can get sympathy and attention, that's a very intentional thing. In your experience, though, how many of these parents are also suffering under a delusion? The Maya Kowalski case was interesting because you did have this doctor, I'm going to use that term loosely, who's telling this parent, she has this issue, and if you don't do this, she's going to die.
Right.
And if I hear that from a doctor, then I'm breaking down the doors of the hospital to get my kid ketamine, right?
Yeah.
So what is the distinction or the spectrum here between just the intentional people who are poisoning their kids and people who maybe are suffering from their own delusions?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the Kowalski case is a good one too, to sort of unpack it with. So the reality is, and we were sort of talking about the difference between these sort of interesting nuances between medical child abuse and Munchausen by proxy. And although they are often linked, people can over-medicalize their children for other reasons, right? That's not intentional. Munchausen by proxy is characterized by intentional deception. And we'll talk about how that relates to the Kowalski case in a moment. But there are parents that have postpartum psychosis, that are suffering from delusions, that are extremely anxious. I think the parents that are vaccine hesitant are a good example, right? Where that's an anxious parent that is a parent that wants to do the best thing for their child. And they've been convinced by a massive misinformation campaign that the best thing they can do for their child is to not vaccinate them, which is incorrect, but that's not a parent that is intentionally making their child's health worse. They're not trying to make, that's not a Munchausen by proxy behavior. So where Munchausen by proxy behavior comes in is, again, this pattern of intentional deception and how it relates to the Kowalski case. So Dr. Kirkpatrick is, you sort of talking about these different types of doctors, right? So there are doctors that will do anything to help a child, right? When they realize this, they really stand up, they put their careers on the line. They, in some cases, like Dr. Sally Smith, their well-being, their safety, their reputation, they will put all of that on the line to do whatever is best to stick to their oath of do no harm and protect that child. And they really see that as their job. There's a lot of doctors in between that, maybe will go along with some things, draw the line on others. Maybe they'll just kick that parent out of their practice because they're really uncomfortable with them, or they'll go all the way down the line with that person. But Dr. Jane Ness, the doctor I was just talking about, she's a celebrated pediatric neurologist. She's a legit doctor. She has this massive flaw, right, where she just didn't apparently recognize or want to speak up about this abuse that was happening right under her nose. There is a third kind of doctor, and these doctors are very scary. And these are doctors that, for whatever set of reasons, honestly, in the case of Kirkpatrick, he's charging $10,000, upwards of $10,000 now for 4-day ketamine infusions, which is his prescription every time. And he diagnoses CRPS seemingly every time. I know this because he's cataloged a lot of his work. It's not just the Kowalski case. So he is a person that is willing, seemingly, to hand out that diagnosis at will, right? And again, with Maya Kowalski, she did not fit the Budapest criteria, which is the criteria for CRPS. She didn't have an inciting injury. It was not regional. It was allegedly all over her body. She just didn't have, she was evaluated by 3 major world-class hospitals before she got to Kirkpatrick that diagnosed her as having a conversion disorder and did not think that these are places that were familiar with the condition of CRPS. And, Beata Kowalski found a group of parents that are networked with each other that recommend these doctors. And Kirkpatrick and Hannah are 2 big ones. And CRPS does appear to be a condition that some perpetrators have latched onto. And I say that because Dr. Kirkpatrick himself said, so many of my patients have been falsely accused of Munchausen by proxy. That's very alarming. Everyone was always asking me, when are you going to cover a false accusation of Munchausen by proxy? And the answer is when I find one. There is one that's in the literature that someone sent me the other day. And I was like, okay, I will do that. I will, so that we can sort of talk about that for the purpose of discussion, because I think it would be interesting. But, this is a crime that is underreported, underprosecuted. So the idea that one doctor within his practice would have a whole bunch of falsely accused parents just completely defies logic. And so, Beata Kowalski also reported to a different doctor, to a pulmonologist, a week before she was in Kirkpatrick's office. She reported to him that the diagnosis was CRPS. So Beata made that diagnosis up. She found, in my opinion, right? And she said, I found this through my research. I found this through my networking, right? And that she was referred to Dr. Kirkpatrick by another parent who said, go to him, he'll give you the diagnosis. And the day after that appointment, Beata emailed Dr. Kirkpatrick and said, thank you for confirming this diagnosis, right? So that diagnosis did not come originally from Kirkpatrick, but he got her in there, and then he $10,000, 4-day ketamine infusion, off to the races, And so I think it's with these kind of doctors, some combination of their ego, right? They get treated like heroes by these parents, financial, right? This is a person who runs an all cash ketamine clinic. He has a vested interest in diagnosing people with CRPS and prescribing ketamine as the treatment, which he appears to do in a pretty unquestioning basis. I've looked into a bunch of his other cases. So that's a situation where, with Beata, it is a Munchausen by proxy case, because you have her engaging in intentional deception. You have her all along the way as she's seeing all these doctors. She went to, I don't even know how many medical institutions in Florida and Chicago. She's going to different ERs. She's telling doctors that her child has been diagnosed as immunodeficient and that these other, with asthma and all these other things that were never confirmed. And so she is, lying about diagnoses. She's telling a doctor that she has CRPS when she hasn't been diagnosed. So it's very different when you have, and I think the ways in which perpetrators with social media are able to access one another and, present themselves as patient advocates and, CRPS moms and say, here's the doctor you need to go to. He knows what he's talking about, wink, wink. It's that's the doctor who's going to give you what you want. And so I think, and then, Kirkpatrick is then presented in this Netflix film as, this big expert on CRPS and this credible person, and then said, he was telling her that her daughter was going to die. That's a little questionable, actually, what he was telling. He did say that when she was in the hospital, which is very the route he went to make CRPS a fatal illness. And now some of his patients have died. That's another big question mark as to what they died from, because CRPS is not a fatal illness. But he said, oh, if she doesn't get the ketamine, she could get a blood clot and that could travel to her, and kill her. Beata was talking about Maya's death in her blog, all the way back. And Beata was the person who was pushing her pharmacist colleague who was helping her prescribe medications, and Kirkpatrick, to label Maya as terminal, I think actually weeks into her diagnosis. So Beata was the one who was pushing that narrative. And so it's the matter of like a perpetrator meeting a very opportunistic doctor. And I will say I have seen doctors that are sort of a little somewhere in between where, there was this doctor in the Sophie Hartman case, Dr. McCaughty at Duke, that was a real head scratcher. I don't think he was a Dr. Kirkpatrick type. Again, he was like a very reputable doctor who'd really done amazing work around this alternating hemiplegia of childhood that Sophie Hartman claimed her daughter has. I say claimed because there was a pediatric neurologist at Seattle Children's who said this child does not have this disease. McCaughty, during the investigation, said, I would defer to that neurologist. I know that neurologist. That neurologist trained with me. And then Dr. McCaughty continued to treat the child after this investigation was over. So that's a real head scratcher. So there are doctors also, I think, that just get, very dug in on this is their thing. This is their thing they've devoted their career to, are trying to maybe make a case that is under-recognized. And so there's just, doctors are humans. I don't know. It's very complicated.
So while you say that these solutions have to be multi-pronged, and it does sound like there's so many things that need to be done, but one of the things at your fingertips is education. And you've done that in droves through your nonprofit, through speaking, and of course, through your podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me. You're up to season 7 at this point. I mean, can you talk a little bit about this season? You said it's taken a little bit of turn. You've expanded a little bit, but I do think this is so important. I'm not the only person to say this, whether you're in CPS, DCF, law enforcement, the medical field, or just child who may be, being subjected to this, or going to school with someone who's being subjected to this. To hear about this and know about it really is, as we say in just about any sort of issue, knowledge is power. So can you tell us about your podcast and what you're doing this season?
Yeah. And thank you for saying all that, Alice. And I think, to your point, like, in order to make any of these changes, you need public awareness and public will, right? Because that's how you get laws passed. That's how you get, any of this stuff that we need to actually sort of push back against this. So our new season, we did take a little bit of a departure, and I think it's one that will follow, because as I've been getting into this, I sort of, when I was first dealing with these cases and just thought, this is sort of this orphaned form of abuse, right? Where there's no training. There is literature about it. There is, academic and medical literature about this abuse, but it's certainly not as robust as other forms of child abuse that are just more widely recognized. And I think when you sort of average person's conception of what child abuse looks like, right, is either child sexual abuse, which we've made incredible strides in, still not solving, obviously, but in at least recognizing. Like, I think that that's something that has been a success in terms of awareness, where people now really recognize that happens, that it's common, and that it's most frequently going to be, these people that you really wouldn't want it to be, right? Your kid's coach or a family member or a Boy Scout troop leader, right? We've come so far with our recognition of that abuse, and that's something that really gives me hope. But I think what most people think of is like people beating up their kids, right? Physical abuse. And this is something that I would have thought had really a lot of public buy-in, because the medical literature is so strong. With abusive head trauma, which is the most common form of child abuse, especially with like children under 5 and especially children under 2, it's a lot of babies. It's a lot of 2 months old and 4 months old, or like, so the sort of 2 peak ages for this abuse. And it's very, very well understood in the scientific realm. There's a huge amount of medical consensus. The AAP published this technical report a couple of years ago that really outlined, strong the medical consensus is around how to make this diagnosis. Because obviously in this case, if you have a 4-month-old baby, they're not going to tell you what happened. There aren't going to be witnesses. It's really incumbent on the medical professionals to be able to make a diagnosis and say, number one, what do these symptoms tell us? And does this match the story the parent is telling? So there's this incredibly broad medical consensus from radiologists, ophthalmologists, child abuse doctors, just a wide variety of subspecialists that interact with these cases that say, like, yeah, we agree on how to make this diagnosis. And yet what I've been horrified to find out as I learned more about it is that in the media, you see questions about shaken baby syndrome and the shaky sign, places like ProPublica, and, that I would think would be above this, the New York Times, which I no longer think is above anything, unfortunately. Just these really NBC, right? You see these reputable, otherwise seemingly reputable media outlets just completely like both sidesism this to death when there is no both sides. And they those same outlets, I don't think, would do that about something like vaccines, right? It is very similar to vaccines. And in fact, as I dug into this for season 7, some of the same people who were anti-vaxxers, Dr. David Ayub is a big one. He used to be the anti-vaxxer was his big thing. And then he made a pivot. I'm sure he's still into that, but he made a big pivot into being abuse denialist a number of years back. And it's the same thing, right? It's just medical misinformation. There's a tiny group of doctors who will basically, and these doctors, again, these are sort of very analogous, I think, to Dr. Kirkpatrick, pretty obviously financially motivated, that go and do defense expert witness work. So whether or not they are actually treating children is another question. Some of them, reading these depositions is such a wild ride. They'll ask them when was the last time that you evaluated a child? And they're like 1981. The one we talk about this season is Dr. Joseph Scheller, who is a pediatric neurologist who does not believe in abusive head trauma. He does not believe, he has testified that shaking a baby cannot harm that baby and cannot kill a baby. That's just it's completely not true. He's way outside the medical consensus. It's a very fringe belief, right? And it's an unscientific belief. There is not scientific literature. There's not peer-reviewed literature to support that idea, but he testifies to it nonetheless. He makes more than $350,000 a year doing this work, and he has never testified on the other side, right? Legitimate experts will be able to say this was, in this case, it was this, in this case, it was not this, right? He's never made the diagnosis of abusive head trauma. He just doesn't believe that it exists, but he's been presented in the media by Mike Hixenbaugh and other people as he's this, a pediatric neurologist, diagnosed the real condition of this child. And so, they'll come up with basically all these other explanations, right? So they'll say, oh, no, this was not abusive head trauma. This child has this thing called benign enlargement of the subarachnoid space. So it's basically the child has a big head, and so there's some extra fluid around their brain. It's a thing that doctors know about. It's a thing that would be in a child's records, and it's something that they rule out. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about child abuse pediatricians is that, and this is an intentional, this is misinformation that's been spread about child abuse pediatricians, is that they're there to diagnose abuse. They're a hammer, everything's a nail, completely untrue. More than half the cases, they're ruling out abuse because they're the most well-trained. They have to do a 3-year fellowship, become a child abuse pediatrician, although some who are working now were grandfathered in because the subspecialty is about 20 years old. But, most of the time they're ruling it out. And so they're only seeing children where there's already a heightened suspicion for abuse. That's why they're there. And so I think for people who are worried about parents being wrongly accused of abuse, which we should be, that's very serious. To take a child away from a parent unnecessarily is a horrible thing. We should have compassion for that and be concerned about it. We take child abuse pediatricians out of the game. The numbers show us that more parents are going to be wrongly accused of abuse or have to go through kind of this lengthy process. But there's this whole stable of doctors who will show up on the stand and say, this wasn't abuse, this child had rickets, or this child has Ehlers. There's a big thing about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder that does not cause fractures in infants. It just doesn't. But there's a Dr. Michael Hollick, who says it does, and he shows up. And so it's just these, fringe, basically quack doctors who are making a lot of money doing this. That's the other thing. It's this is America. Unfortunately, even our healthcare system is very infected by capitalism. If people are making a lot of money doing things, then you should question that. And people try and assign this financial motive to child abuse pediatricians. Well, they're saying they're getting paid to do their job too, right? They're not getting paid extra to rule in or rule out abuse, right? They're not incentivized. They're just doing a job, which people have to be paid for their jobs. But so this is sort of this whole ecosystem that we're looking at in season 7, this misinformation about abusive head trauma. And we get into this parent group that I've had a source in for the last couple of years that I've been monitoring, called Fractured Families, who they're in their public facing role. They say, oh, we're here to support people who've been falsely accused. They've been very connected to a lot of these media stories. Most of the other, if you'll remember from Take Care of Maya, obviously a lot of focus is on the Kowalski case, but they do this thing in the film where they sort of broaden the lens, right? And they have these 4 other families in these very quick snapshots saying that they were wrongly accused by Dr. Sally Smith and how it ruined their lives and how now they're speaking truth to power and whatever. So in season 7, those are all abusive head trauma cases. And one of them involves also some other fractures. So one of the things we do in season 7, and we start with Jon Stewart, who is charged with the murder of a 15-month-old baby, which is not mentioned in the film, by the way, and really unravel those cases. And spoiler alert, it does not appear that any of those families were wrongly accused of abuse. And, then in the end of the film, they have this other whole sort of like B-roll where there's like people, you see all these faces of all these families saying, we were this, we were that, all these families. You're like, oh, so, the viewer walks away with like, oh, this is a really big systemic problem. Number one, this Dr. Sally Smith, throw her off a cliff because she's kidnapping children. And then, oh, this is happening to all these other families. Almost all of the families are part of this group, Fractured Families, and they were coordinating this media coverage. They were talking to Caitlin Keating, one of the moms, Viviana Graham, who's been, on a mission the last 10 years to try and discredit Sally Smith, was posting screenshots from Caitlin Keating. They coordinated that behind the scenes. And so this group, Fractured Families, has been fascinating and horrifying to dig into because a big function of the group is to connect families with these experts. And they have a list and they say, families will post and they say, oh, we've been falsely accused of abuse. Who do we see for rickets? Who do we see for Ehlers-Danlos? Like, who can give us this diagnosis that we're looking for, right? And so I think what's been fascinating and why this felt like a natural place to go with the show is because even though these are not Munchausen by proxy cases, they still involve a lot of deception. They involves the medical system, and really this sort of like idea of this made to order diagnosis of like, I want this diagnosis for my child because that will then be exculpatory for me. And so I'm going to go to this doctor who will give it to me and who will come and testify for me on the stand. And it's really alarming the way that these cases have been presented in media outlets like My Kicks and Bods Do No Harm, like Diane Neary in The Preventionist, where they're presenting these cases as wrongly accused families and saying these doctors were wrong about their diagnosis of abuse, and they don't treat that like that's something they have to prove, right? So, like, as you guys know, someone not being prosecuted or not being convicted of a crime does not mean that crime didn't happen. I mean, that's a wild logical fallacy to start with. So that's our season 7. Yeah, it was kind of a doozy.
I'm glad you're covering this. I mean, this is going to be super controversial. I mean, because I was first exposed to this with the Robert Roberson case out of Texas. I don't know, that guy may be innocent for all I know. But what shocked me when people discussed that was just the statement. And you see, this Innocence Project said this, that shaken baby syndrome is discredited. It's like your doctor friend you were talking about. It just doesn't exist. Like, never happens. It's like completely made up. It's like, it's so many people believe that now. And we saw that on our Facebook group, people just saying, well, that's that's like bite mark analysis or dunking people to determine whether they're witches. It's like, no,
it's really not. It's really the opposite of that. It's the opposite of that. It's robust science and peer-reviewed research over decades. I mean, it's so, and the Roberson case, like, we probably will end up covering that because there is so much misinformation about that. And that's actually, the Roberson case is very similar to, and I've only read like a brief that someone sent me. So I have not yet done like a full deep dive on that. So I won't talk too much about it. But, the Roberson case is very similar to the Jon Stewart case, right? Where, so typical, we were sort of talking about when you think about like shaken baby, the reason they changed the name, and there's sort of one of those things where it's presented conspiratorially, like, ooh, they don't say shaken baby syndrome. It's like, yes, because they changed the terminology. Like, that's not evidence. Weirdly, that's not evidence of a cover-up. But the reason they changed it to abusive head trauma was because, shaking is a mechanism through which abusive head trauma can happen. But actually, in the Jon Stewart case and in the Roberson case, that was blunt force trauma to the child. So it was thought to be like the mechanism is more like smashing the child against, a bed, or it's not just the sort of shaking mechanism. The problem with, with shaken baby, sort of the classical shaken baby, where you look at, again, the biggest months for those are like 2 months and 4 months. If you've been a parent, you know what that period of having a small child is like. And I think one of the things that I'm so heartbroken about with this misinformation about abusive head trauma / shaken baby is that there was a massive and like pretty successful public health campaign to get people to recognize that you could really hurt a baby by shaking them. And that when you're talking about, a 2-month-old, like, it does not take much force to really hurt them because, their heads are big in relation to their body, and that mechanism can really hurt a vulnerable baby. And I worry now that we're losing ground on that, and people might think that, I hope that people do not extrapolate like, hey, it's okay to shake a baby. But I think when you're saying it's not happening, you can't solve a problem that you're pretending doesn't exist. And that's what we're doing right now with these abusive head trauma cases. But the interesting thing about the Roberson case is it's not a shaking case. It's really this blunt force to the child. And his story, just the circumstances of this case, just like off the bat, it was the first time he'd ever been alone with the child, and he was, kept her overnight for the first time. And then he claimed that she fell off the bed. I think she was 24, 25 months, so she's a couple years old. It's a little older than Nolan Kelly, but claimed that she fell off the bed and then didn't call the doctor. And then when he woke up the next morning, this is the story as far as I understand it, said, oh, she wasn't breathing and she had this problem. Well, he still didn't call the doctor. He called his girlfriend. And I think people need to just sort of like take a deep breath and remember reality. And especially if you're a parent, 2-year-old children fall off the bed and fall off things all the time. I have a boy who is almost 4, and he has spent most of the last 2 years just like jumping off things. It's just like children are.
My 18-month-old flipped off the couch, caught himself with his head. And I was like, oh, well, my goodness.
Right.
He was fine, but it was a one-time
you
thing.
You have to go to the ER video, right? So it's
not even.
Children fall off couches, chairs, beds all the time. That is like their whole, it feels like that's their whole mission in life.
It's like their thing. It's their thing.
Like their thing. Yeah. They're learning boundaries, right? So it's like they fall off all the time, and they do not die when they fall off beds. And that is not what killed this child. And, I know they've sort of brought in like pneumonia, like this child was evaluated. And also the medical examiner's statements have been really mischaracterized. It's just bizarre morass. And I think part of what people, and I suspect why the Innocence Project is so on board with it. And now I know John Grisham's writing a whole book on it. And I'm like, I guess I'm going to have to try and call him. Anyway, I'm sure he will listen and reconsider his position. We'll see. But, is that just people kind of like lose touch with reality, right? It's like they sympathize with this man who's been on death row, and they don't like the death penalty. And nor do I, by the way. I do not support the death penalty. And I don't even feel extremely passionate about people being in jail for a long time. I think there are very legitimate questions about Roberson's, like, should he still be in jail 20 years later? Again, I don't believe in the death penalty. So like that, I'm clear on that. I don't think he should be I don't think these are helpful ways to deal with abuse. But the idea that like nothing happened, that it like that's wild. A child is dead, and a child did not die from falling off the bed. And, it was very similar with the Nolan Kelly case that we talked through. Like they sort of tried these other things, and his, John's defense attorney during the, depositions that we have, which are from a dependency trial, not the criminal, because it was not prosecuted in the end. But we're trying to say like, well, he was sort of just throwing all these, oh, did he have meningitis? Well, no, he didn't have meningitis. There was an autopsy. There was no sign of meningitis. Well, could he have had this? Could it have been one of the other children in the house who are under 6 years old? Could it have been this? Could it have been that? And it's sort of like just trying to, like, no, this was ruled a homicide. This child was murdered by someone. We should want to know what happened. And after that, there can be a conversation about appropriate remedies for people who do this to children. And I think the thing that is always sort of striking me as an irony is I think that actually in my position, I'm a lot more empathetic towards people that harm children than I think most people are. I think most people need to either think this, it's like with the Roberson, right? And with like John Stewart, same thing. They need to either think this person killed a baby and we have to take the utmost sort of punishment route for them, or they're innocent and they deserve to be exonerated and they were wronged by the system. And I think there's a lot of space in between those things. And we're never going to get there to a better solution if we're just denying that it's happening at all. So yes, I look forward to many, many angry emails about the Roberson case whenever we get around to covering that.
But like we said, having this conversation is so important, and you digging into it so deeply is just fascinating. Thank you for bringing all of this to light as well in your latest season. And like you said, it might not be the last one that covers this sort of thing, right?
Yeah, no, I think we'll probably stay on that. I think also because there are all of these other lawsuits against child abuse pediatricians that are really fixated on abusive head trauma. And again, they are using these quack doctors. I have to say, like, I just, given the tenor of the media coverage around this, as I was digging into these, again, it's sort of like I started with an N of one, right? Mike Hixenbaugh for NBC and his Do No Harm series covered my sister, Megan Carter. And I was like, I know he's wrong about Megan. And I know what he left out about Megan's case. Number one, that she'd been, reported by 3 other area hospitals. Number 2, that she'd been investigated for this abuse before. Number 3, that there's a 37-page, he made a big deal of the doctor not being a child abuse pediatrician in that case. Well, there was a 37-page report detailing the abuse from one of the most celebrated child abuse pediatricians in the field. So I knew exactly what he'd left out. I knew that is still ignoring my emails, for years, trying to bring these things to attention. Like, I sort of knew what that case was. And what I assumed in the beginning was this journalist has found other cases where parents really were wrongly accused of child abuse and lost custody of their children. And then that created this belief that is being reinforced, and he's sort of missing this, and people don't understand Munchausen by proxy. That's what I assumed. But as I dug into the rest of his reporting, I was just like, the only thing his big case, the Bright case that he covered in his podcast, Do No Harm, and again, there was no police investigation into that, which that's like another curious one. And you wonder why there wasn't, but and there was a bunch of stuff with CPS, and a lot of the podcast was about all the failures of CPS. And that's fine. The family did win a judgment against CPS for, the things that went wrong in that case. But he's saying the medical diagnosis was wrong. And that's a separate thing, right? And he's saying the doctors, at Texas Children's Hospital that made this diagnosis were wrong. And the only thing that he uses to shore up that idea is the opinion of this defense expert, Julie Mack, who is she's a radiologist who mostly does breast imaging. And she shows up as a defense witness in child abuse cases all the time. She's like one of the most notorious abuse denialists. Texas Children wrote a huge letter to Mike Hixenbaugh about like, hey, don't present that. Basically, like, here's the reason not to present this person as credible. And that's someone who is working with the family as their defense team. And there's a place for defense expert witnesses. I'm not saying we shouldn't have them, but that's not the same as like a treating physician. And so now I'm sort of in this place of like, and again, with like, the ProPublica piece about Nancy Harper and the preventionists, these ones that I've spent a lot of time digging into the cases, I'm just like, I don't know if these people have even found one, like, legitimate. I mean, Take Care of Maya, like, again, I've gone through all of those cases. It's just like, I don't think these people have found one. They've just found cases where, even in Take Care of Maya, one of those cases, the guy was criminally convicted. It's like, what are we doing? Like, what are we talking about? So yeah, it's frustrating, but I think I assumed there was going to be, because of the media, because there's so much media coverage about false allegations and shaken baby syndrome being discredited, and you see it so many places, and there's just been this tidal wave. Like, I assumed there was something more to it than just, hey, we found this, tiny percentage of quack experts that say it's not real. That seems like a really irresponsible thing for the media to lean on.
Well, we all love controversy. That's why we're here. I say controversy because you're finally talking about it. You guys, go listen for yourself. Nobody Should Believe Me is on season 7. Everything you're hearing here, Andrea, you are a firecracker. I am so glad you're in this space. You do so much. We haven't even touched on really the tip of the iceberg of all that you are doing. Before we leave for the day, because I don't want to take up your entire day, is there anything else that you're working on that you want our listeners to know about so they can go support you?
Well, I have my book, The Mother Next Door, which I co-authored with Detective Mike Weber. That is actually coming out in paperback soon, but it is also an audiobook. I read the audiobook. So if you just like listening to me yap, there's another place that you can go listen. And that, I think, is a really good primer. Like, if you're just, if you're just diving in and sort of want to learn about this abuse, I think that's a good primer. I would say if you're new to the podcast, what I would suggest starting with season 1, but from there, because that's kind of our like Munchausen 101. That's the Andrea Dunlop How She Got Here 101. And from there, you can kind of listen to any of the seasons. The seasons are sort of their own encapsulated thing. But yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Brett, is there anything else you'd like to add? I know we could keep her for like hours, but we're trying to be.
I could talk to you forever. If you ever want to come on,
I will come back on anytime.
We would love to have you back on.
Yeah, but thank you, because this is really important. And there aren't many voices willing to say the things you're saying. And, the Maya case was, you were swimming against the stream in that. With Netflix putting, Netflix documentary, if it's in a Netflix documentary, it's probably false. So Netflix is putting all their power behind that, and everybody's watching it and they're blown away by it, and they're not asking the right questions. So thank you for being willing to stand up and do that. I know it wasn't easy, and just really appreciate the work you do, and good luck on season 7.
Thank you so much. And thank you guys for having me on. It's been great chatting with you, and I would be happy to come back anytime.
Thank you. You guys, we're holding her to it. She has to come back because I know you guys have loved this episode. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us today. And thank you all for listening. Go check out Nobody Should Believe Me and also The Mother Next Door. We can't wait to have you back, Andrea. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Remember the other night when we were recording and I said I had an interloper outside? Mm-hmm. So it was Squanto. He had set up, he put up a little like fort at the top of the stairs because I'm near the stairs, and he had put like a blanket and pillows, and he was laying there listening to me. And I was like, I can't remember what we said, but it was probably pretty murderous.
I think that was Nova Scotia, wasn't it? So,
yeah, that was pretty murdery.
A lot of people died.
That was a lot of murdering there.
Not great.
Well,
not great.
Probably explains a lot of his problems.
There you go.
At first, I didn't think it was real. I woke up to this blinding light, and I was transported to another place. Pluto TV! Then I heard a voice.
Come with me if you want to live.
There were thousands of movies and shows, and they were all free.
Truth is our sin.
It's just so beautiful.
On Pluto TV, free streaming of Terminator 2, Fringe, Arrow, The 100, and The X-Files may cause excitement, loss of sleep, and sudden belief in extraterrestrials. No credit cards or alien encounters necessary. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.